This series is dedicated to Brother Steve Coakley.
Quote, "It cannot be said that we are too poor to patronize our own press to any greater extent than we do now. For in popular demonstrations of odd fellowship, Freemasonry and the like, we expend annually $10,000 to $12,000. If we put forth a call for a national convention for the purpose of considering our wrongs and asserting our rights and adopting measures for our mutual elevation and the emancipation of our enslaved fellow countrymen, we shall bring together about 50. But if we call a grand celebration of odd fellowship or Freemasonry, we shall assemble, as was the case a few days ago in New York, from 4,000 to 5,000, the expense of which alone would be from $17,000 to $20,000, a sum sufficient to maintain 4 or 5 efficient presses devoted to our elevation and improvement. We should not say this of odd fellowship and Freemasonry, but that it is swallowing up the best energies of many of our best men, contenting them with glittering follies and artificial display, and indisposing them to seek for solid and important realities. The enemies of our people see this tendency in us and encourage it. The same persons who would puff such demonstrations in the newspapers would mob us if we met to adopt measures for obtaining our just rights. They see our weak points and avail themselves of them to crush it. We are imitating the inferior qualities and examples of white men and neglecting superior ones. We do not pretend that all members of Odd Fellow societies and Masonic lodges are indifferent to their rights and the means of obtaining them, for we know the fact to be otherwise. Some of the best and brightest among us are numbered with those societies, and it is on this account that we make these remarks. We desire to see these noble men expending their times, talents, and strength for higher and nobler objects than any that can be attained by the weak, glittering follies of odd fellowship and Freemasonry. We speak plainly on this point, for we feel deeply." End quote. Frederick Douglass, 1848.
The best and the brightest of black men, as Frederick Douglass put it, were far more dedicated to the pageantry of fraternal organizations than they were to the upliftment of their fellow man. This frustration was exposed by Douglass in the year 1848. As weird as it may seem, several Masonic lodges are named after Frederick Douglass, but according to the curious minds of the top Prince Hall Mason researchers, no evidence has ever been found of Douglass's involvement in Freemasonry, although speculation persists unto present day. His long cultivated relationships with international aristocracy only fueled that speculation. However, one of his relationships that remained the most secret during his first writings was his relationship with Anna Murray, whom he eventually married and had children with. After the publication of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845, Fred's popularity became world-renowned. Doubters across the world lambasted the work, characterizing his autobiography as a gross forgery, which could have never been written by a former slave. Over 10,000 copies were sold in America and Europe, which caused Fred's mentors and friends to theorize that his former owner may track him down and try to re-enslave him under the fugitive slave law. The friends for whom he kept anonymous put him on the path that led to his social amnesty in New Bedford, Massachusetts. After a few months of being there, he by chance happened to meet for the first time in his life William Lloyd Garrison, future famous abolitionist and editor of The Liberator. In no time, Fred became a fan of The Liberator, often memorizing the articles and holding discussions at anti-slavery meetings held in New Bedford, Massachusetts, an abolitionist city. One night, Garrison asked Fred to speak at an anti-slavery convention before at least 1,000 people. Although he stumbled through his speech, he aroused the crowd into his favor and impressed the likes of John A. Collins, an agent for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. This was Fred's first taste of the limelight, and it wouldn't be his last, as his popularity only grew from this moment, which caused his friends to speculate upon his recapture. So he sets off for the Emerald Isles as a means of dodging potential recapture as a result of his newly acquired reputation. While abroad, Douglass often remarked about the feeling of equality he was treated with. Racism was far less notable in Europe, and on most occasions, he was treated no differently than his white contemporaries, a sentiment later expressed by Marcus Garvey. On his visit, Fred fell in with some of the most prominent abolitionists and aristocrats in Europe, people like Daniel O'Connell, Thomas Clarkson, and George Thompson, just to name a few. Upon his re-arrival to America, he began publishing his first newspaper, the North Star, a periodical dedicated to the abolition of slavery. This endeavor brought Douglass in direct competition with his friend, William Garrison. As his circulation grew in number, the two men's friendship descended into opposition over their ideas surrounding the Constitution. Garrison was a staunch contender to the letter of the Constitution as its stance as a pro-slavery document. He argued that the 3/5 compromise declared it thus. But Douglass defended the Constitution with this statement: "For it be remembered that the Constitution nowhere forbids a colored man to vote." Although his stance on the abolition of slavery was clear, his position began to compromise itself within his support for women's suffrage. At the Seneca Convention in 1848, as the only colored speaker in attendance, he all but equated the struggle for women's equality with the black struggle for freedom. In doing this, he gained support from the top women of the 19th century suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, just to name a couple. One could even say Douglass was the first black or semi-black feminist. Using their friendship as an extension, Stanton knew the vote for women's suffrage wouldn't pass without a boost. She urged Douglass to include women's suffrage on the same bill with black men's right to vote. Rather than separating the issues, she intended on combining them into one and the same. Oh, Freddie was like, nah. It was the same year in 1848 as the Seneca Convention when Douglass made his comments about the overly festive organizations of Freemasonry and the Odd Fellows. In an earlier episode, we discussed the life of Prince Hall and the emergence of Black Freemasonry in America. Although much is still unknown about the early years of Prince Hall, we can make this definite point. He was not an indigenous American, and his ancestry is undoubtedly European. Hailing from Barbados and being born in the 1730s meant he was most likely the child of an English merchant or tradesman. In his book, The Official History of Freemasonry Among the Colored in North America, Grimshaw states Grand Lodge Freemasonry has been accepting so-called Negroes since its establishment in 1717. Although Freemasonry claims to trace its origins all the way back to the construction of the Temple of Solomon. In Europe, its history is conflated with stonemasonry in order to deflect from its origins. But a very important question must be asked. How did this information end up in Europe when it had been unknown for ages? The temple wasn't built in Europe, but Jerusalem is about the same distance as LA from New York. The oldest Masonic manuscripts on official record, but the legend dates back to around the 900s during the tenure of King Athelstan, when England was a Roman province.
Quote, the Hallowell manuscript, also known as the Regius poem, is the earliest of the old charges. It consists of 64 volume pages of Middle English. In this, it differs from the prose of all the later charges. The poem begins by describing how Euclid counterfeited geometry and called it masonry for the employment of the children of the nobility in ancient Egypt. It then recounts the spread of the art of geometry in diverse lands. The document relates how the craft of masonry was brought to England during the reign of King Athelstan, the year 924 through 939. It tells how all the masons of the land came to the king for direction as to their own good governance, and how Athelstan, together with the nobility and landed gentry, forged the 15 articles and 15 points for their rule. This is followed by 15 articles for the master concerning both moral behavior and the operation of work on a building site. There are 15 points for craftsmen, which follow a similar pattern. Warnings of punishment for those breaking the ordinances are followed by provision and annual assemblies. There follows the legend of the 4 crowned martyrs, a series of moral aphorisms, and finally a blessing. End quote.
Several other Masonic manuscripts later surfaced can only be dated from the late 1400s through the 1800s, with information being added or omitted, not at all consistent with the Hallowell manuscript or Regius poem. Each time a new Masonic manuscript surfaces on the official record, it comes from an exclusive private collection belonging to some of the world's most trusted gatekeepers, from Templars to the Scottish Rite, and various other brands or degrees in between. One could legitimately surmise, with the exception of Prince Hall. Where, when, and how Masonry came to form a secret cult in Europe abounds with theories, but nonetheless, the institution is in universal agreement. The craft wasn't born in Europe. Some Masonic scholars say the craft began in Egypt, but most concede its beginnings instead lie with the construction of the Temple of Solomon, and to a lesser extent, the legend of Hiram Abiff. To Freemasons, the name Hiram Abiff has an almost mystical or mythical meaning, and he is a main player within the initiation process of nearly all Masonic lodges. Hiram Abiff is said to be the architect of the Temple of Solomon during its construction. As the legend goes, Hiram was threatened to be murdered if he did not divulge his master mason's secret. He refuses, and as a consequence, he is attacked by 3 so-called ruffians, the first, second, and third injuring him in different ways before he is eventually killed by the last attacker. The details surrounding this story all vary depending on which lodge one may be initiated. The most essential fact about this fable is that the personage of Hiram Abiff is never mentioned in the earliest versions of the Old Testament. This character is instead an allegorical mythos for some type of organizational credo. This credo on its surface seems transparent, yet the deeper the dive, the waters become more translucent. In the first book of Kings, chapters 5 through 9, the reader is introduced to a man whose title is the king of Tyre, who goes by the name Hiram. Hiram had friendly relations with King David according to 2 Samuel chapter 5. And after the death of David, the friendship continued with Solomon. As king of Israel, Solomon inquired of Hiram, the king of Tyre, to help with the construction, requesting the choice cedars of Lebanon. The only tree vast enough for the massive construction could only be found one place on earth. Wonder where that could be. Although Hiram contributed much of the materials used in the construction of the temple, there is no record of him actually being an architect. On the contrary, he was a king and ruler of what would be considered an elite naval fleet. Hang on tight, because this story is about to get confusing, because 2 chapters later, in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 14 states that Solomon sent and fetched Hiram of Tyre. Verse 14, he was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding, and cunning to all works in brass. So here we are introduced to another Hiram, just after the mention of Hiram, king of Tyre. But based on this verse, this man isn't an architect, the king, nor the son of the king, an assertion made by Freemasons, but rather an artificer of metal, especially brass. Unless we are not being given pertinent information, one could reasonably assume that maybe this is the king's illegitimate child, and his architectural background is being hidden from the words in Scripture. But the confusion doesn't end here, because in the second book of Chronicles chapter 2, verse 11 reads, Then Hiram, the king of Tyre, answered in writing, which he sent to Solomon. Yet again, 2 chapters later, in chapter 4, Chronicles, verse 11, Hiram is again the name used to relate to the metalsmith. Be all this as it may, neither one of these men is an architect of the temple as written, or has any more contribution on the scriptural record. So how could either one of these men be Hiram Abiff? Some other divisions of continental Freemasonry, as opposed to Grand Lodge Freemasonry, changed the name from Hiram to Adoniram. Hilariously, several so-called credible researchers have called this a simple renaming of Hiram to Adoniram, not realizing that Adoniram is an actual person mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 4 and 5, a prince in the court of Solomon, who was over the levy of 30,000 traveling men. To add another nugget of context to this story, 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 10 through 14. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the 2 houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees, and with gold according to all his desire. That then Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. And he said, What cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Boule unto this day. Hiram was not at all pleased with the 20 cities in Galilee given to him by Solomon, and in his disappointment he questioned Solomon with an embittered tone. What are these cities which thou hast given me, my brother? Nothing else is officially mentioned concerning Hiram's discontent with his endowment on record. According to Young's Analytical Concordance, the name Hiram doesn't appear again in Scripture. So how exactly Hiram expressed his dissatisfaction with his gratuity is left to speculation, although the following verse says, he again gives Solomon 60 talents of gold. The myth of Hiram Abiff isn't the only divider of Freemasonic principles and ideals. The most pronounced divide is often something that divides all people alike and different. For the Freemasons, this issue caused the schism that disunified the organization into opposing sects of Freemasonry. And that issue is the belief in God or a supreme deity. Traditionally, the belief in God, or as Masons call the great architect of the universe, was a fundamental prerequisite for admission into Masonic society. But ultimately, this belief would lead to the Great Dissension. The belief in God eventually amalgamated into staunch Christianization, and on the other end, the idea of a Mason worshiping a non-Christian God, presumably anyone other than Jesus, transformed into atheism. Another considerable factor in this schism was American racism. After the Grand Orient of France recognized colored men in Louisiana, but the traditionally racist Dixie Lodges Cocoa-stepped their craft cheese and put out word for other Anglo-American lodges to do the same. Don't be mistaken, Grand Orient of France Masons are not the same as Anglo-American branches of Freemasonry in the South. The first Masons of color who followed Prince Hall hailed from Boston, an abolitionist stronghold of Massachusetts, whose philosophy on race was in blunt opposition to the Confederate caucus delegation. But the issue of God was a festering dispute since the infiltration of the Grand Lodge by the Irish in the year 1717. But who were these infiltrators, and how do they differ from their imposto predecessors? One of the most notable misnomers regarding the lineage of Europeans in general is the assumption that the ruling families of England are in any way indigenous to the land, disregarding the fact that forensic anthropologists assert ancient Western Europeans had dark skin and blue eyes combined with straight hair, and the current representative population only has 2 out of 3. Even the current ruling family of Britain, the Windsor family, is actually a repackaged English version of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha lineage, whose ancestors hail from specific areas throughout Germany, Belgium, Austria, the Netherlands, France, and Spain, as represented in the extensively colorful symbolic representation in the family coat of arms. One symbol that is not seen on this family coat of arms is that of the bull, whose image can be seen in numerous tribal coats of arms among the ruling families of Caucasia. The image of the bull is most likely a prototypical representation of the golden calf from the book of Exodus. The hidden symbolism behind the rulers of the Isles is the truth that smacks you in the face from behind the illusion. For as skeptical as a person may be about the credibility of Torah, the truth is written in history and is present in nature and evolves through prophecy. Back to Prince Hall. After his death in 1807, Nero Prince takes over as the second Grand Master of Prince Hall Grand Lodge. It is extremely critical at this point to note, Nero Prince was not black. He was a Russian Jew. But as Grimshaw records, he identified himself with colored people and did everything to perpetuate Freemasonry among them. Prince, the Russian Jew and second Grand Master of Prince Hall Freemasonry, worked in the court of the Grand Duke of Moscow and was employed under the direction of the Tsar, being elevated to personal security of the Emperor. He was celebrated as a Russian national hero for turning back the French army during the invasion of Moscow by Napoleon. His wife was a writer who wrote about her life as a Russian diplomat and free-born black woman. She even recounts her experiences in Jamaica
with the Jamaican Maroons, who had just returned home after almost 50 years in exile in Sierra Leone, following the Second Maroon War, in which Jamaican soldiers were sent to Sierra Leone to kill Africans on behalf of the British, who ultimately left them stranded. The 14th Grand Master, John Vansel de Grasse, is most well known for being the first so-called African American to be formally educated as a doctor in the United States. But de Grasse wasn't actually African or American in the classical sense. His father was most likely of French Hindu ancestry, and his mother was a free woman of color, with her family being Dutch of Haarlem, Netherlands, but also Moorish or Moroccan in origin, whose ancestor, Jan Jansen of Haarlem, was a Dutch pirate who ventured as a Dutch-Moorish double agent attacking ships along the Barbary coast of North Africa. When he attacked a Spanish ship, he would fly a Dutch flag. When he attacked any other ship, he would fly one of the various crescent moon and star flags at his disposal. After getting captured by a Muslim fleet, he became a Turk and no longer sailed under the Dutch flag. Jansen lived mostly estranged from his family and had numerous children with women from different countries. In the early 1600s, his children from the Netherlands were some of the first Dutch to settle in New York, aka New Netherland, aka Haarlem, named after a region in the Netherlands. His descendants, Dutch immigrants, were recognized as free people of color back then, but continued to marry into upper echelon white aristocratic families, whose descendants include Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, the affluent Whitney family of London, and even the Vanderbilt family, who migrated from the very same region of the Netherlands. Membership to the exclusive fraternity of Prince Hall included some of the most well-to-do colored men in America, with secretaries like William Billy Costin and Grand Masters like John F. Cook and Nero Prince. We can notice a specific pattern developing within this ambitious cult of supposedly colored men. Not only were many of these men of strong Caucasus pedigree, this sort of pedigree qualified as a prerequisite for certain membership opportunities. An example of this can be obviously seen a century later with the inaugural class of Sigma Pi Phi. As we can see from the early records of the first so-called black members, there seemed to be a slavery to Amazine Church to Freemason pipeline, and at the end of that pipeline, for those who proved themselves useful, was politics. It goes pretty much without being said that by the time of Frederick Douglass's ascension, the overwhelming majority of so-called black politicians were connected to the Amazine Church and were also Prince Hall Freemasons. But are we completely sure Frederick Douglass wasn't a Mason? Rumors abound. Evidence fleets. On this episode of The Black and the Reckless, Fred has grown tired of his wife, Anna Murray. After traveling the world, falling in with diplomats, and presumably tasting the forbidden fruit of a ginger-flavored pinky toe, his simple housewife and mother of his children just don't churn his butter no more. So Fred decides to get his butter churned out in the cobblestone streets. Rumor surfaced that old Freddie Mac had dipped his dingleberry in a bowl of Lucky Charms out in Ireland, and at the head of this rumor was none other than William Lloyd Garrison, his former homeboy, had dimed him out like Kobe did Shaq. But this wasn't the only time Fred was accused of dipping his dingleberry in the calcified, unseasoned Caucasus waters. Oddly assing
was a German Jewish feminist who literally tracked down Freddie just to churn his butter. By the mid-1800s, Freddie was the most famous mulatto in the country, proudly wearing the crown of the black delegation. Conferencing with the likes of nearly every politician at the time, from Abe Lincoln to Andrew Johnson to Ulysses S. Grant, and several other legendary men of lesser note as well, including the infamous John Brown. According to the narrative, Brown secretly approached Douglass before the raid at Harper's Ferry to lobby for his support and to join his militia. Fred declined, telling John this plan was a suicide mission. Fred didn't reveal any details linked to his conversation with Brown about the raid until 20 years later during a speech at Harper's Ferry. After the raid, Douglass was considered a fugitive in the state of Virginia. He was accused of both supporting John Brown and not supporting him enough. While on the run, Douglass traveled through Canada undetected and escaped again to England, returning a few months later after the death of his young daughter. During the Civil War, Douglass was somewhat critical of Abraham Lincoln, drawing attention to his delayed response to the suffrage of black men and the fact that he only supported the deflation of slavery and not the elimination of slavery. Of course, with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation didn't mean that racism ended. So-called black men had rights to vote and hold office, but white supremacist militias like the White League and Red Shirts were terrorizing blacks mainly throughout the South, consequently undermining indigenous participation in their civic privilege through violence. Don't be mistaken. Even these Klan groups have a political agenda. At the time, the South was run by Democrats, aka Dixiecrats, and these militias formed as a way to keep blacks from voting Republican. Contrary to present day, before 1900, the rank and file of colored politicians were Republican, and freedmen voted Republican. And it would really remain like this until the run-it-back wave of feminism in the 1960s, when the black vote would switch to Democrat. Even the early feminists were devout Republicans. But once again, they would try to colonize some more cachet from everybody's favorite Negro. In 1872, Fred became the first so-called black man to be nominated for vice president. Didn't even know they nominated vice presidents. But of course, it was a nomination for the unestablished Equal Rights Party. Fred played Melvin, and a white lady 20 years his junior played David Ruffin. And I know this may come as a surprise, but they didn't win. Later on, Fred was named president of Freedmen's Savings Bank. He was basically hired as a big-name, black-faced fall guy. Freedmen's Savings Bank was a government-approved Ponzi scheme by which Congress installed all-white cronies who defrauded literally thousands of newly freed and colored peoples out of their entire savings. Government-funded embezzlement is the best description of the Freedmen's Savings fiasco. All of the responsible white parties involved in the collusion were not held liable. A perfectly designed loophole drawn by the pen of Congress. If the prefix pro is opposite to con, then what is the opposite of progress? 1 year after the death of his wife Anna Murray, Fred got remarried to Helen Pitts, a woman 20 years his junior, a feminist, and a bona fide pilgrim. Straight Mayflower, cuz. Not only was she repping Plymouth Rock, but she had presidential cousins. One would be very surprised if Fred could contain himself from dipping the old dingleberry in the diplomatic ponds of a Plymouth Pinky for more than a day. But Fred was 60-something at the time, and the old dingleberry didn't have much time left. In fact, they both weren't getting any younger of her family. The Pitts family never considered themselves racists. They even considered themselves friends of the black plight. That was until their daughter married a Negro. You racist! The couple was married by a prestigious African-American Presbyterian minister, Reverend Francis Grimke, whose family can trace all the way back to the first Europeans to colonize South Carolina, as well the first members of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, also known as the Boule. The Grimke family was a well-connected clan of the mulatto aristocracy. The first Grimkes in America colonized South Carolina in the 1600s. John F. Grimke was one of the city and slave trading hub of Charleston's first mayors. His paternal ancestors were German Jewish merchants from France. His mother's lineage was of French Huguenots, who were secret Jewish conversos who left Spain after the Inquisition and rebranded themselves as Christians in France and Germany. Beyond any doubt, the first colonizers to the New World were bands of Sephardic Jews, in many cases posing as Christians and brutalizing the indigenous population in the name of Christianity. But many of these people weren't even Christians, and some weren't even Jews. Many of the unknown colonizers of South Carolina were secret Moors. This isn't speculation, this is fact, and finely scrutinized documentation proves this. Hardly a single legit Christian was first to step foot on American soil. And they were most likely Moors and Sephardic Jews escaping Catholic oppression, posing as Christians. The Protestants came later, especially following the American Revolution, an event that renowned historians assert was orchestrated completely by the Freemasons, as was the French Revolution. But some historians even say that the French Revolution had a larger impact on world history than did the American Revolution, and Freemasonry may have something to do with that. The ideas of where a man acquires his rights was a philosophical debate among the ruling powers. And does man have the natural right or freedom not to acknowledge God? And say a man does acknowledge God, does it have to be Jesus Christ? Or does a man have a right to choose his own God? These philosophical questions were at the heart of the French and American Revolution. Looking back, these wars were about more than just the theater of battle or the written history of the nations. These wars were about whose dominion reigned supreme on earth, God or man. On the next episode of Boule, we investigate the first Moorish and Sephardic bloodlines that colonized the American South. And we'll show how the first colonizers of America were not classically white. On the next episode of Boule.
As I take every step, I can see every breath in this frigid landscape. What fire can a man make? And tell me, what chances can a man take if his heart is frozen? What choice he asking his own voice as he waits for a nigga to get sloppy? He stay poised, 10 minutes and he spot him like got him with the drop on him. Opportunity to feed somebody, options. Ain't do or don't, but when and where, how and why oughta go without saying. My nigga, he ain't playing, these ain't games out here. We untamed out here. And don't nobody give a fuck about fame out here. And if you think a motherfucker caught your name out here, pow, you gotta blow a motherfucker brain out here. Meet and greet a pistol when a nigga gotta eat. Can't take a hot shower, so we gotta pack the heat. And it's a cold, cold world out there.